Welcome to LearnQuest Academy. Today we are going to be discussing habitats in biology. So our topic is aquatic habitats, part 1. First of all, we have to define what exactly is an habitat. An habitat is a natural home where plants and animals live. That's a simple definition. And there are three major kinds of habitats. We have the aquatic habitat, which, which is the habitat of water, then we have terrestrial habitat, and we have arboreal habitat. Aqua means water, so that's where we derive water from. So it's the habitat of organisms that live in the water. Aquatic habitats include the marine habitat, which is the sea, the estuarine, where the river meets the sea, and then freshwater, which is majorly the rivers. The terrestrial habitats include the forest, grassland, swamps, marshes, arid land, or deserts. Now, in this lesson, we are going to be discussing majorly the marine habitat, and we are going to be discussing it extensively. The sea is divided into two main zones, which are the littoral zone, and the benthic zone. The littoral zone extends from the shore to about 200 meters deep. So if this is the top of the sea and this is the bottom, the littoral zone is around here, where this point to this point is about 200 meters deep. It has three smaller zones, which are the splash zone, which is above the high tide. So in a sea, we have the high tide and we have the low tide. So the splash zone is above the high tide and it gets wet only from the sea spray. We also have the intertidal zone, which is between the high tide and low tide. So let's clean this up. And let's assume that in the sea, this is the high tide and this is the low tide. So the intertidal zone is around here between them. Then it is covered by water at high tide and exposed during low tide. As you can see, if this is the high tide, and this is a low tide, definitely during in the intertidal zone it will be covered in water with water in the high tide and then it will be exposed in low tide. The subtidal zone is always under water and it extends from the low tide to around 200 meters deep. Now we're going to be going to the benthic zone. The benthic zone is the deep seafloor and it begins after 200 meters and it can reach up to 10,000 meters deep. So that shows you that that's the depth of the sea averagely is about 10,000 meters. It also has very little light. The water there is cold and dark because if it has little light, that means that the heat from the sun will not reach there, very well, and so it will be cold and it will be dark. Then there are also very few living organisms that are there. Right now, we're going to be discussing light in the sea. So, how does light intensity vary inside the sea? Sunlight reaches only about 200 meters below the sea surface, and that's why photosynthesis can only happen in the upper part of the sea, that is 200 meters above the sea, below the sea surface to around 0 meter, that is to the surface of the sea. Then below 200 meters, plants cannot make food because there isn't enough light. So you can't find plants below that 200 meters. So there are only few or no plants below 200 meters from the surface of the water body. That's an important thing that you should take note of. Now we are going to be discussing organisms found. So near the shore, especially at the intertidal zone, the organisms found there are barnacles, oysters, mussels. You do not have to cram this, but we'll be using a lot of these organisms in explaining the other part of this note. So just know them. We have seaweeds, which is a plant, anemones, sponges, sea urchins, sea cucumber, and basically near the shore, we have the highest variety of plants and animals. And there's an easy way to remember what we just discussed. At the just see the splash zone. Like let's assume that you're on Lekki Beach in Nigeria. So just see the splash zone as where your slippers get splashed but does not enter the water. Then intertidal zone is the wet sand where the waves come and go. So sometimes you see water there, sometimes the water will reduce. Then the at the subtidal zone, that's where you swim because it's always covered with water. So the area is always underwater. Then at the benthic zone is like the deep Atlantic Ocean. It's dark, cold, and there's almost no sunlight. And this is a simple memory trick that you can use. Sister B, where B stands for benthic zone. This cis is for the littoral zone, and this B will be for the benthic zone. So where the first S is splash, the second S is subtidal, and the middle I is intertidal. That's a simple trick you can use to always remember. And this is just the drawing of the intertidal zone of the zones basically. You can see that the sea is divided into two main zones, the littoral and benthic zone. So you can pause this video to study this very well. You can see this is the high tide line and this is the low tide line. Then the littorals, the splash zone is basically where the water splashes around here. Then the intertidal zone between the high tide and low tide. Then the subtidal zone is always below water. Then the sunlight penetrates about 200 meters, and after 200 meters down this way, as you go down, the light intensity will begin to reduce until it's almost dark. Then at the benthic zone, it begins after 200 meters. So this is the benthic zone. These are some animals that are there, and they feed mainly on dead plant and animals that are sinking from the surface. So because there are basically almost no organisms there, and we have a lot of organisms at the littoral zone. So when the organisms at the littoral zone sink, the organisms in the benthic zone feed on them. You can pause this video to understand the zones better. Then this is something that you should always remember. Two 200 meters light ends and about 10,000 meter. That's the deep sea floor. Let's move. We have different types of shore. The sandy shore. Most beaches in Nigeria are sandy and have fewer organisms than rocky shore. Also, on the sandy shore, there is no seaweed, and common organisms on sandy shore are starfish, ghost crab, clams, and eyelid worms. You do not have to cram this, but you also see the cases or the examples of where they are used later, just so you can know. Then the ghost crabs, we are going to be discussing their adaptation for the sandy shore. The ghost crabs are sand colored for camouflage. Then they live in burrows above the high tide mark, and they come out to search for food. So this is how they survive. We just used this, we took this and I just tried to explain the adaptation of ghost crab to the sandy shore. We also have the muddy shore, and common organisms on the muddy shore include small worms, crustacea, many birds. So the muddy shore has more birds than the sandy shore. And as you can see, on the sandy shore we have starfish, ghost crabs, but on the muddy shore we don't really have that. We have just crustaceans, many birds, small worms. So you can note the differences in the organisms that you find at the sandy shore and at the muddy shore. Then the last one is the rocky shore, which has the greatest variety of plant and animals because rocks provide places for organisms to attach and hide. And this is just an illustration to show you sandy shore, muddy shore, rocky shore. You can pause this video if you want to study this image better. Adaptation of shore organisms. Now, before you can have adaptation, there has to be a problem, and that's where this problem comes from. So, what problem are these organisms adapting to? So, the problem is waves and tides can wash organisms away. So, how do the shore organisms survive? Now, the shore organisms, example, just like I mentioned before, the seaweed, the barnacles, the limpets, they can ask this in your exam that give us adaptation of shore organisms. So it's better you always remember this. So for the rocky shore organisms, which are the seaweed, barnacle, and limpet, the seaweeders hold fast to attach to rock very well. The seaweed is also known as sargassum. The barnacles cement themselves to rocks, and the limpets grip rocks with their muscular foot. Then for the organisms in the sandy and muddy shore, they dig burrows to avoid being washed away. Sorry. You know that sand is soft and mud is soft, so that's why these organisms they discover that in order not to be washed away by by the waves, they can actually just dig burrows. Why you see these barnacles, because the rocks are hard, so they can't just dig. They have to cement themselves, so they attach themselves very well to rocks. Limpets use their muscular feet, and seaweeds they use hold fast on the rocky shore. And this is just a diagram for you to see to understand it better. This is a diagram of seaweed, diagram of barnacle. This one is limpet. This one is crab, ghost crab. So how do organisms cope with drying out? You know, the organisms that face drying out are majorly organisms at the splash zone and intertidal zone. Just like we have explained before. Yeah, this is covered by water at high tide and is exposed during low tide. This is this gets wet only after sea spray. So these are the two major zones that face drying out. And we're going to be discussing adaptation for drying out. So how do these organisms cope with drying out? In the splash zone, organisms can survive both on land and in water. So they are adapted to survive in both. So that when there's water there, they are able to survive, and when there's no water, they are able to survive. For example, the periwinkle breathes in air like land snails. The ghost crab has gills for when they are in water, so they can easily breathe in the water. Then they have a spongy breathing structure. Note, not lungs, so a spongy breathing structure for land. Then for intertidal zone, organisms reduce water loss by burrowing into sand or mud. So for splash zone, the organisms are adapted to survive both on land and in water. But majorly in the intertidal zone, the organisms try to just reduce water loss. And they do that by burrowing into sand and mud. So they are not able to lose so much water when they are deep inside the sand or mud. Then they close themselves inside shells or tubes. They also sea animal pull in their tentacles and store water, so they just try as much as possible to save water. There's some animals hide in rock crevices just to save water. Now moving on to zonation. Zonation can be defined as the arrangement or distribution of different plant and animal communities into distinct horizontal bands or zones within an habitat. So we have variety of plants and animals and of organisms basically. And so zonation is like, let's say this is the entire sea. So the organisms divide themselves into distinct horizontal bands. So some organisms will occupy this place, some will occupy this, some will occupy this. So that's exactly what this is saying. Different organisms live in different parts of the shore, and organisms near the splash zone they can withstand a lot of drying. Organisms near the low tide mark can withstand only very little drying. So zonation allows for adaptation of different organisms. So after the splash zone and intertidal zone, we also have to discuss the subtidal zone. The subtidal zone is always underwater and it is rich in both producers and consumers because it is always underwater and it is in the notes. The subtidal zone has light. That's why it can have producers. So light penetrates into the subtidal zone. It is inside the benthic zone that we have very few or even no plants at all. And this is a simple memory trick. So imagine you went to Takwa Bay in Nigeria or Elegushi Beach in Nigeria. On the rocky shore, the organisms stick tight. On the sandy shore, they dig burrows. On the splash zone, they can live both in land and water. In the intertidal zone, they must survive both waves and drying out. And then for the subtidal zone, they're always underwater and they're always full of life. So this is an example of Takwa Bay in Nigeria. So you can visit. So it is a picture, so you can visit the place. Yeah, if you are looking for somewhere to go during the holidays, then I got this from Wikipedia Commons, and no changes were made to the image. And this is Ilegushi Beach in Lagos, Nigeria. Very cool places. Now, exam essentials. It's important that you remember these 5 facts. First of all, rocky shores have the richest biodiversity. Just like when we were discussing the kind of animals that you can find in when we were basically discussing the sandy shore, the types of shore, you can see here the sandy shore has starfish, ghost crabs, muddy shore has crustaceans, many birds, but in the rocky shore we have crustaceans, birds, basically what you can find in sandy and muddy shore. And we have a variety of organisms because the rock provides what places for organisms to attach and hide. So let's go back to where we were. Yeah, so rocky shore have the richest biodiversity. I'm just trying to go over what we've discussed before so you can remember and then we flow along. The burrowing is the main adaptation on sandy and muddy shore. Remember, I said they are soft, so they can easily burrow into them. The barnacles cement. Now, this is something that WASSCE also asks sometimes. These are common examples of organisms there. The barnacles, limpet, seaweed. So seaweed use hold fast. Limpet cling with their muscular feet. Barnacles cement on rocks. And this prevents them from being washed away. Then zonation is basically organisms arranged in horizontal bands according to how much drying that they can tolerate. The subtidal zone, we've discussed the intertidal zone, the supratidal zone or the splash zone. Now, this is the subtidal zone. The common animals that we can find there are the snails, crabs, lobsters, crayfish, stingrays, soulfish. What our advice is for each of the zones, learn at least two organisms that you can find there. So in the subtidal zone, we can find snail and crabs. In the splash zone, you can see we can find periwinkles, we can find gross crabs. In the intertidal zone, we can find sea anemones. So WASSCE can ask sometimes, WAEC can ask this question sometimes. So just learn animals that you can find at the various zones and you'll be good to go. So let's go back to where we were. So these are organisms that you can find there, and the adaptation at the subtidal zone is always covered with water. So the flat body helps it stay afloat on the sea for stingray. Then for soulfish, you do not have to learn this. These are not common examples, but just so you can always remember. Some animals have flat body to help them stay on the sea. For soulfish, it lies on one side with both eyes on the upper side. Then both hide in sand or mud and hunt small animals. In the benthic, for the benthic zone, we've discussed the littoral zone. Now it's time for the benthic zone. It's not a good place for life. That's why you can see this X that is here. Why? It is very dark, very cold, has low oxygen, and under very high pressure. I mean, this is like the top of the river, of the sea. We are discussing sea here, that's the marine habitat. And this is like the bottom. So a lot of water is here. So the benthic zone will be around here, sure, from here to here. So there's a lot of pressure from the top. So only very few organisms, only organisms that are rugged or very strong can be found there. And there are no producers there. And only a few specially adapted animals. Later, we'll see the adaptation of the animals that are there. Now, the animals there, just like I said before, they majorly feed on detritus or animals sinking from the surface. So we are going to be going to the surface waters now. What kind of animals can be found on the surface? We have plankton and nectins. Those are the two major animals that can be found on the surface. This is nectins and this is plankton. So plankton are animals that float with water current. An example, we have two types, two major types: phytoplankton and zooplankton. Diatom is the most common phytoplankton that when we are discussing marine habitat or food chain, majorly what we discuss is diatoms. Or you can also use algae. Algae are also phytoplanktons, and they are the foundation of the marine food chain, just like I said. Then zooplankton, examples are protozoa, copepods, worm, larvae, mollusks. They are very tiny. Plankton and nectins are very tiny, and they stay afloat using, this is also an adaptation. They stay afloat. How they stay afloat? Oil droplets, gas filled floats. They also have spines or ears. I think this is the easiest to remember. They have spines or ears that help them stay afloat. So I gave an easy example. Why I said this spine and ears is very easy to remember is because just throw a dry leaf into the water or a stone, you see that the dry leaf will float because it has a higher surface area. So planktons use the spine and ear to have that similar effect, that is to have a higher surface area for floating. So let's say this is a plankton, it's gonna have a lot of air, a lot of air. So that will kind of increase the surface area, and that will make it to float. We also have nectins. Nectins are active swimmers. So plankton flow with the water current, they float or drift, but nectins, they actively swim. And examples are fish, squids, crabs, prawns, whales. So for each of the categories, I advise I just learn at least just two organisms. Adaptation of nectins, they have streamlined body. Just basically think of adaptation of fish. Streamlined body, which help them swim faster. They should have strong muscle, which help them swim for long. Then swim bladder, so they can easily, if this fish, for example, this fish that you can find there, it can change the amount of air in its swim bladder. So if it reduces the amount of air there, it will sink because it is air that keeps it afloat or buoyant. But if it increases the amount of air there, it will go higher. So it helps them in diving, and it also controls floating by adjusting the amount of gas there. And you can just pause this video to look at, I just made a table to show the difference between phytoplankton, zooplankton, so that I can better visualize these things. You can pause the video to study it. Then we have deep sea fish adaptations. Since food is scarce, the lights, they have light organs to attract prey because that place is very dark. So if a prey goes there, it has and it sees light, you naturally just go towards that light, and as it goes, it can easily be eaten by the deep sea creature in the benthic zone. They also have large expandable mouth and stomach to swallow large prey. So because you know that they are deep inside the ocean or sea, and they don't have access to food all the time, so they have a large mouth to be able to swallow prey, so that they are able to at least survive for long periods without food. So when they eat a lot of food, they can go on for days without food until they find their next food, and they mostly feed on detritus, just like we said before. Example, you can just note this: snailfish and tripod fish. This is a lot. I know it's a lot, like learning a lot of organisms, but if you are consistent, if you are focused, these things are actually easy to remember. The marine food chain. The marine food chain has phytoplankton. This is how most of the food chains go. Phytoplankton. An example we've said before, diatom. So phytoplankton, zooplankton, maybe fish, then mackerel, then tuna, then shark. Then 10 exam facts always remember. Subtidal zone is always underwater. Benthic zone is cold, dark, and low in oxygen. So only very few organisms are found there. There are no producers found in the benthic zone. The deep sea animals feed mainly on detritus. The planktons drift or float on the water. The nectins swim instead. The phytoplankton are what? Producers. Now, how do you always remember that phytoplanktons are producers? Look at phyto from chlorophyll, PHY, chlorophyll. So, zooplankton are consumers, like zoo stands for animals. So, you know that plants produce, animals consume. Then, marine food chain begin with what? phytoplankton, especially diatoms, just like I mentioned before. I really hope you loved this video. If you enjoyed it and really want to master marine habitats, I made a marine habitat zonation cheat sheet that is very graphic. It has a lot of diagrams, illustrations, and contains most of what you need to know under marine habitat WAEC level. Click the link in the video description to access the cheat sheet. Wishing you success in your exams.